Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode with the Anxious Resistance. Today, I'm going to be talking about a lot, and it's the depression cycle. After many years of suffering from depression, it has become more and more apparent to me that the general population of the world has no idea what a vicious cycle, sometimes vicious spiral, depression can be. Actually, I doubt that the world even knows what a vicious cycle is. So let me explain. A vicious cycle is a collection of events that are directly connected to and intimately devolved from the original incident or factor. For example, poverty is a well-known vicious cycle. Poor people cannot afford an education to get out of poverty, and even if they can, then they can't afford food. Without food, the chance of an effective education is very low. When your only worry is where your next meal comes from, everything else is subsidiary. A person cannot thrive when they are barely surviving. This is true for depression, much the same way it's true for poverty. But let me explain further. One of the greatest symptoms of depression is a greatly decreased level of motivation. Without a driving force, it becomes impossible to do even the easiest of tasks. When a person is heavily depressed, it becomes harder and harder to make themselves meals and eat real food. As if that isn't enough, it gets harder and harder for individuals to get themselves out of bed the more depressed they become. With a lack of motivation, depression can also cause physical harm to individuals who stop eating and even lose their muscle mass from being bedridden for so long, thus reducing the potential energy of the depressed individual. Now, with lesser energy than before, the tasks the person used to perform before the onset of the depression become unreachable, both by lack of motivation and energy. But no, the cycle is far from over there. When I was going through therapy for my own personal depression issues, my therapist one day asked me how I felt about myself. I never really liked myself and really disliked being alone. Concerned, my therapist told me that I needed hobbies. Having something you like to do when you're alone is one of the biggest ways to enjoy your alone time. Learn to love yourself and find motivation to do things. But as we saw before, old hobbies are no longer viable. We don't have the energy or motivation to do them. So we have to search for new hobbies, easier hobbies. But still, things that allow us to be alone with ourselves and our thoughts. So watching TV or online videos does not count as a hobby. Rather, it should be something creative, with the idea ingrained in me that it should be something imaginative that lets me improve and find satisfaction despite my own perfectionism. I started gardening and cooking more often. Now, I said it should be easy hobbies. We can get into harder things later, but for now it's important that we actually do something and start to regain our motivation. I wasn't very good at either gardening or cooking, so the process was slow. Plus, plants don't tend to grow overnight. They take time. And the thing that interested me the most was bonsai. Being the perfectionist that I am, I felt that I had to grow the trees from seeds and raise them from the beginning. I wasn't very consistent with my plant care, and the place I live in is incredibly dry, so all of my plants died. After some time, however, I was gifted with a near-dead Christmas cactus. If you don't know much about Christmas cacti, they're incredibly hardy. Though it hadn't been watered for months when I got it, I was able to put it somewhere I wouldn't forget to water it. After some months, I revived that cactus, bought a nice and happy handmade Mexican pot, and replanted it in its new home. Now, years later, I still enjoy the beautiful buds and flowers that come off of it. As for the cooking, things started off similarly. As a child, my grandma used to make an ice cream jelly cake roll. Now, I did have some experience with cooking and baking going into this hobby, but nothing extreme. Despite my enduring perfectionism, the ice cream roll cake came out terribly on multiple occasions. It took a while for me to learn, but sometimes it is better to work up to harder projects. Also, with my lack of fine motor skills, bakery was much harder for me than general cooking. At the time, I had a precious basil plant that I had bought on a date where we made style margarita pizza. I learned later that basil is a very finicky plant, but for whatever reason, mine thrived, even with the poor care I gave it. Anyways, I decided that I wanted to combine my cooking and gardening hobbies into one. So the logical extension of that was to make a food dish that uses basil. I already knew how to make the margarita pizza, so I needed something else. Ultimately, I decided to make pesto, an Italian concoction with pine nuts, Parmesan cheese, olive oil, and of course, basil. Pesto is great as a flavor spread for sandwiches, grilled cheese, burgers, you name it. but those don't really require skill. So I found a recipe online for a chicken pesto pasta. Similar to an Alfredo sauce, I learned to use the pesto with heavy cream and Parmesan cheese to make a delicious sauce to get on noodles. Many years later, lots of new recipes under my belt, it is still my fiance's favorite dish that I make. Now, by nature, vicious cycles are hard to end. Depression is definitely not an exception to this. Despite the desire that depressed people often show, they don't actually want to be alone. And they do want to go with you to do things, but it's hard. Don't be like me and start your new hobbies or the hobbies of your depressed friends with something huge. Perfectionism and depression often go hand in hand. Find something easy that can be mastered faster, then slowly move to more difficult things. The sense of creativity and motivation from your new hobbies can be one of the greatest helps to propelling a depressed person up and away from this spiral into the abyss. Now, if that wasn't enough, depression is also coupled with anxiety. Usually one is worse than the other, but both working in tandem also make their own vicious cycle. If you're like me, then depression is your bigger problem. You're also a perfectionist. So when you're in school, you aren't motivated to do your homework. As an educator-to-be, motivation to do homework can be a problem for many different reasons besides depression, but that's a topic for another time. Anyways, if you're depressed and don't have the motivation to do homework, you put it off for as long as you can. Procrastination. But eventually the perfectionism will kick in. With much less time and an increased level of anxiety, schoolwork becomes a bigger chore than it was prior. Much like depression, anxiety can be debilitating. In all likeliness, not all that schoolwork, homework, house chores, job projects, etc. will get done. This leads the perfectionism to tell the individual that they're worthless, increasing the depression levels in the individual, only to start the same process all over again. The cycle can be much harder to break than the other, but isn't a permanent trap. One of the best ways to overcome the perfectionist depression anxiety cycle is to lessen the load, like finding easier hobbies, taking on fewer classes, household chores, or work projects makes it easier to finish the ones you do take on. This can make it easier to overcome the tendency to procrastinate, especially with the satisfaction of actually finishing all the tasks on your plate. Once that has been done, the cycle is ultimately broken. It may be prudent, however, to still ease into more difficult and more abundant tasks. That way, you're ready for a full load and don't drown right back into the cycle you just came out of. While that is one option, another might be for someone to keep you accountable. In my situation, I have really busy wedding planning, working, overcoming financial crises, dealing with car problems, serving in my local church, and having a personal life. Especially over the last few years, my schoolwork has been forced to the back burner. Now, since it's the last day of class, I have way too much homework to do and very little motivation to do it than I would be without their guidance. Ideally, the best way to overcome the perfectionist depression anxiety cycle would be to overcome the perfectionism. That isn't as easy as it sounds, though. I am no therapist, but mine was one of the biggest helps I had in overcoming my perfectionism. Not to say that I'm completely healed of this curse on my soul, but my levels are much more manageable now. Some things that really helped me overcome my perfectionism were to find those hobbies and let myself be good at them. You don't have to be perfect at everything, but it does help to be good at one thing. Additionally, it is okay to give up sometimes. My first few semesters of college, I did an extraordinary job, got good grades, and took way more credit hours than I should have been comfortable with. Then I failed a few classes. I thought the world was going to end, but it didn't. I moved on. I was able to take the classes again with little impact to my life. Learn how to fail. Don't let failure define you. Learn how to learn from that failure. Lastly, the thing that has helped me to overcome my perfectionism was to stop comparing myself to others. You aren't other people. You're you. Stop trying to be someone you're not and start finding what makes you individual and unique. Your interests can be part of this, but find your talents and skills. Find the people you like to be around. The ultimate and difficult cure to self-inflicted depression is self-love. You don't need to seek affirmation from others to feel better. You need to learn to affirm yourself. Sometimes that involves making changes in the way you do things, but it also often requires looking at yourself from another perspective. One of the things people greatly misunderstand about anxiety and depression is that you can't just get better. Actually, Nothing ever made me more upset than people telling me to just be happy. Depression is a vicious cycle that once started can be incredibly difficult to break out of. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means you have to make some changes to your own life to overcome. This is an article that was written by my brother, Zane Gunderson. You can find this article linked below. Thanks so much for listening to this about the depression cycle. If you enjoyed the video, please like it. Subscribe to our channel for more content about mental health. Thank you so much for watching, and a big shout out to my brother Zane for writing this article and being vulnerable about his depression and sharing his experience with the world. Thank you guys so much for watching.